So we are going to talk about the southern colonies today. We already talked about the northwest colonies or the northeast colonies and the New England colonies, basically, and the middle colonies. And today we're going to talk about the southern colonies. So if we're in Buzz, let's go to Buzz here. If we're in Buzz, and in Buzz, we go to third period social studies. Emily, you have a question?
Yeah, so we're going to be doing a part 2.
Yep, part 2 we'll cover tomorrow. So we're going to split the southern colonies into 2 parts. So for our assignment, we're going to go under quarter 3 assignments, then week of February 22nd, and then the Thursday folder there. And there's a couple things posted there. So you have the southern colony terms is what we're going to talk about. So what were some important terms of the southern colonies? So if we open that, read it up, the teach it and the read it. Remember, that's our article where we get a lot of our information. So in this article, it talks about the 7 terms that we're going to cover. So we have head right, indentured servant, Bacon's Rebellion, proprietor, the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. Then you have indigo and plantation are the ones that we're going to look at. So those are our 7 terms that we're going to cover as we go throughout our lesson today. So you can look in the read it too to find some information about that. And then you have access to our slideshow. So we're going to go through our slideshow here in a second, and I'll help you with that'll help you with answering the questions. And then our show it for today, it says Southern Colonies Part 1, show it. So if we open that up, let me just read through the questions. That way we know what to look for, and then we will go into our lesson for today. So the first one, it says identify the Southern colonies. So out of the list here, we have to identify what are the 5 names of the 5 Southern colonies. So we're selecting 5 answers for number 1. So we'll do that here in a second. Then number 2, it says, what were the goals of Bacon's Rebellion? So we're going to learn about this guy named Nathaniel Bacon, and he led this rebellion in the Southern colonies. So what were the goal of his rebellion? There was 3 goals of his rebellion. Then number 3, it says, what is an indentured servant? So what is an indentured servant? What does that mean? We'll cover that today. Number 4, it says, how much land was given to new settlers that paid their way to the colonies in the headright system? So how much land was given to new settlers? We'll cover how much land that was. Then number 5, it says, what are the 3 crops that were mainly grown on the plantation in the southern colonies? So we'll type in the box, what were the names of the 3 crops that were grown mainly on the plantation in the southern colonies? Then number 6, it says, which color or what color does indigo dye make? So what color is indigo basically? Indigo is a crop that they grew in the southern colonies. Then number 7, it says, what was a proprietor? So what does a proprietor do? What is a proprietor? Then lastly, number 8, our last question, it says the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 ensured freedom of religion of the blank faith only. So this was the only faith that was able to practice their freedom of religion. So what faith was that? So we'll cover that in our last slide. So these questions will go in order. So you just have to follow along, and I'll let you know when we get to each question as well. Okay. So make sure you have your show it open, and let's open up our presentation. All right, so here we go. So our southern colonies. So the southern colonies, we've already talked about the New England colonies, which are up here in the northeast portion of the United States. And so our New England colonies were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And then you have our middle colonies here, the breadbasket colonies. They were New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So they're right in the middle colonies. And then today we're covering our southern colonies. So here are our 5 southern colonies that were a part of the southern colonies. So this will be answer number 1. So our first southern colony is Maryland. So you have Maryland here. So go ahead and select Maryland for number 1 there. So Maryland was 1 colony. Then right below Maryland, you have Virginia. Virginia was the 2nd colony there. Then right below Virginia, you have North Carolina. And then below North Carolina, you have South Carolina. And then below South Carolina, the last colony is Georgia. Georgia. So those are the 5 southern colonies. So make sure you've selected all 5 of those for number 1. So the 5 colonies again are Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. All righty. So these southern colonies, we're going to take a look at what are some of the specific characteristics of these colonies. So we're going to start by looking at Virginia here in a second. So part 1 covers terms that we need to know. So let's take a look at some of the terms. There's 7 terms that'll help us answer the rest of our questions here. So our first term is Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion. And whenever I hear bacon, I just think of the food bacon. So that's why there's so many images of bacon on here. It's such a yummy food. So Bacon's Rebellion. This was actually when we divide that word up into, we have bacon and then we have rebellion. So Bacon, this is named after the gentleman who led this rebellion. So this is led by Nathaniel Bacon was the guy's name. And a rebellion is when you're going against something. You're rising up to go against something. So he's causing up a stir to go against something that he doesn't approve of. So this rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon, and this happened in the Virginia colony between the years 1675 and 1676. So this is still before the United States has become a country, almost 100 years before the United States will ever become a country. And this is just a time when colonists are coming over from Europe and they're trying to start their new life here in the New World. So this rebellion was led by these poor colonists that were not really given equal rights here in the new world, in the new colonies, the southern colonies. So Virginia colonists were becoming angry because they couldn't vote unless they owned land. So that was one of the reasons that led to this rebellion. Colonists were becoming more and more angry because the only people that could vote in elections and vote in these big deals would be people that owned land. And in order to own land, you had to have money. You had to be rich. So a lot of these colonists that were sailing over didn't have a lot of money. So they weren't rich, they were poor. And so they weren't able to vote. And so everything that was being ruled against them was basically forced upon them that favored the rich people rather than the poor people. So for the rich settlers that grew cash crops like tobacco, times were very good in the new colonies. So the rich settlers were able to grow their crops and then sell these crops to make a lot of money. And then times were good because nothing was really slowing them down. But times were very hard in the new colonies, in the southern colonies, for the poor settlers and farmers who couldn't afford to build big plantations. So if you couldn't afford to have a big area of land or have a big field of land to grow a lot of these crops, then you couldn't make a lot of money. And so you were very poor and you had basically work for someone else in order to make your money. And then on top of that, you had Native American tribes that kept attacking as they tried to protect their ancestral land. So Native American tribes were angry at the colonists, the southern colonists, for trying to take over their land. And so they tried their best to protect their land that they were already living on. But we'll see as the time went on, the Native Americans would eventually get forced out of their area because they didn't have enough manpower and they didn't have enough of weapons to be able to protect them and push back the colonists from taking over their land. But this was just kind of some of the hardships that these colonists were facing here in the New World, is because they couldn't vote in the elections and they didn't own a lot of land. So they had to basically force themselves to work for someone else. So the struggling colonists began to ask for help from their government. And their government was led by Lord John Berkeley, who we talked about a few weeks ago. So Lord John Berkeley was the leader of the Virginia government, and he refused to help these colonists. And so this made the colonists angry, and they formed a militia. So the colonists decided to form a militia, which is a military group, basically. So a group of people who formed, who had weapons, but they had other jobs, but they were willing to fight for a cause. So a militia they're not getting paid to be part of a military group. They work another job like a farmer or a merchant or a tradesman or a craftsman, but they're willing to fight for a cause to try to earn their right to vote here in the new colonies. So they formed a militia, and they were trying to defend themselves and trying to earn the right to vote. So militia groups started to beat opposing native forces in 2 different battles. So they started to defeat themselves or protect themselves against the Native American attacks. And the militia, they enlisted the help of another Native American tribe, but that tribe was often killed off in massive numbers by another Native American tribe. So the Native American tribes would often fight against each other because some of the Native American tribes wanted to be allies or be friends with the colonists, and other Native American tribes did not want anything to do with the colonists. So oftentimes that would cause a lot of conflict and war and battle. So you would see fights between Native American tribes and between the colonists and Native Americans. So after this rebellion, some of the followers of Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion were elected into the House of Burgesses. And the House of Burgesses is the government building, the government kind of setup of the colony of Virginia. And so this is one of Nathaniel Bacon's goals, was to get some of the poorer people into the House of Burgesses. That way they could start passing laws that would help those that were poor in the colonies. Okay. And then, so we're about to get to number 2. We're just covering Nathaniel Bacon here. So we're going to get to what he did. So what did Nathaniel Bacon do? So Lord John Berkeley declared Bacon a rebel and a traitor for going against the government, for going against Berkeley's orders. And so new elections were held in the House of Burgesses for the first time in 14 years. So the House of Burgesses was often ruled by these rich people, and the poor people had no say in any of the matters. But as Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion went on, more of his people, so more of the poor people, were elected into the House of Burgesses, and they were able to kind of pass laws that would help with those poor people. So Bacon was pardoned from forming this rebellion. So he was forgiven, and he was no longer punished for forming this rebellion against the government of Virginia. So now let's get to, what did Nathaniel Bacon want? So this is going to help you answer number 2. So what did Nathaniel Bacon want? So he didn't like how the government or the colony was being governed. So what did he want instead? So there's 3 things that he wanted. So the first thing is that he wanted Berkeley, Lord John Berkeley, who was the governor, to authorize raids against the Native American tribes. So he wanted the Berkeley to authorize trades against the Native Americans. That's the first thing you're going to click for number 2, is he wanted Berkeley, the governor, to authorize raids against the Native American tribes. So he wanted the colonists to be able to attack and get rid of the Native Americans who were being violent against them. The second thing is that Nathaniel Bacon wanted to be the leader of the raids. So Nathaniel Bacon wanted to be the leader of these raids. He wanted to be the general in charge of the forces going against the Native Americans. So he wanted to be the leader of the raids. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is that he wanted to see change in the way that Virginia was governed. So Bacon wanted to see change in the way that Virginia was governed. So he wanted to see change in the Virginia government. All righty. So your 3 answers for number 2 would be that the first one would be that he wanted Berkeley to authorize raids against Native tribes. The second one was that Bacon wanted to be the leader of the raids. And then the third one, it's Bacon wanted to see change in the Virginia government. He wanted to see change in the Virginia government. So Berkeley did not really give into Bacon's request because he didn't want to betray his Native American allies. So he was afraid of going against the Native Americans because a lot of them was his allies. And if he went against and started to fight against the Native Americans, then maybe his allies would start to leave him and start protecting the Native Americans instead. So that's why Berkeley and Bacon were always going back and forth with each other. Okay. So that is our first turn that we'll cover, Bacon's Rebellion. So that'll help answer number 2. And that's kind of one of the longer ones that we'll talk about today. Then our next term is called an indentured servant. So that's going to help us answer number 3 here. So an indentured servant, what is an indentured servant? So an indentured servant is a person who signs a contract with a sponsor, and that sponsor helps pay for their voyage to get across from Europe to get to the new colonies. So an indentured servant, they start off by, they were mainly living in Europe, and they were experiencing a lot of hard times in Europe. And so they weren't really living a good life in Europe. And so they decided to come over to the new colonies. But they didn't have enough money to make it to the new colonies. They didn't have enough money to make it to the new colonies. So they had to kind of ask people to buy their tickets to get across the Atlantic Ocean. They had to ask people to get across the Atlantic Ocean, basically. So they would often offer up their services. So they would have to work for the person that bought their ticket for them. So they often would have to work for about 5 to 7 years for the person who bought their ticket. And after they worked those 5 to 7 years, then they were free to live in the colonies however they wanted. So because they weren't rich enough to buy their own ticket to get across the Atlantic Ocean, they had to basically try to beg somebody else to buy their ticket, and then they were forced to work for that person for 5 to 7 years once they got to the new colonies. And then once they worked those 5 to 7 years, then they were able to live throughout the colonies however they wanted. So most of the servants came from Europe, and they were very poor and looking for a better life. And so this system was placed because the New World had so much land, but not a lot of people to work on that land. So there was so much land in the New World, and they needed more people to help work on the big fields, to help plant crops, to help pick the crops, and they needed more and more people, as many people as possible. So the servants were often given clothes, a passage to the colonies, and then after their time as a servant, some even received, so after their 5 to 7 years, some of them even received about 25 acres of land. They received a year's worth of corn. They received arms, which are like guns or weapons. They received a cow and new clothes to help start their life. So once they were able to make it through their 5 to 7 years, then they were able to have all of that for themselves. But it was very hard to make it through those 5 to 7 years. It became very hard and difficult to make it through the 5 to 7 years of work. So oftentimes, the servants were usually aged 15 to 25. So they were about 15 years old to 25 years old. And almost half, so 50 to 60% of the servants died before they ever became free. So being an indentured servant was very dangerous because you basically sold your soul to come across the Atlantic Ocean to be in the new colonies. And you had to do whatever the person you got your ticket from, you basically sold your soul to, you had to do whatever they asked for about 5 to 7 years, no matter what. So if you refused to go against them, if you refused to do what they said, then they had all the right within to punish you. So most of the time, these indentured servants would die from disease because they were living in harsh conditions where they weren't able to basically protect themselves. Some of them died from punishment. So eventually, after a couple of years of doing the same task over and over and working, a lot of time the indentured servants would refuse to work, and so they were punished. So they were either killed or severely injured. And then the last thing is most of the indentured servants died from extreme work. So they were put to work for hours at a time, all day and all night. They were put to work to try to help on this plantation to help them make as much money as they could. And since they had to work for 5 to 7 years, they were trying to get as much work as they could out of them between those 5 to 7 years. So once you were able to make it through those 5 to 7 years, then you were able to become free. So again, for number 3, an indentured servant is just a person from Europe who signed a contract to work for a person.
What was the first one again?
So the first one is just the 5 colonies that were a part of the Southern colonies. So look on the first slide.
Okay.
That'll show you the 5 colonies. Okay. So far we've just answered questions 1 through 3. So again, 3, Zach, is just, it's a person from Europe who signed a contract with the sponsor. That's an indentured servant. Person from Europe who signed a contract with a sponsor. Then our next term is a headright. So a headright. So this will help you answer number 4. So a headright, this was basically land that was given to people. So it was 50 acres of land given to new settlers that paid their own way to the colonies. So if you had enough money to buy your own ticket to get across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to get to the 13 colonies, then you were basically just given land for free. So if you bought your ticket and arrived in the new colonies, you were given 50 acres of land. So that'll help you answer number 4. So in a headright system, everybody that was able to buy their own ticket to get across the Atlantic Ocean, they were given 50 acres of land. And so when you're thinking about an acre, if you think about your house or where you live at, most people's house is on about a half an acre or about a quarter of an acre. So if you think about 50 acres, that's a lot of land.
My house has a full acre. The
Yes.
backyard.
Yes, so some people might live on a full acre as well. So just by sailing into the New World, you would just get 50 acres. So that's a lot of land they were giving up because there was so much land here in the New World as they were discovering it. So settlers that were already in the New World at the time received 2 of the 50 acres. So they basically received 100 acres of land. And then another weird thing about this is every time you sailed back and forth between Europe and the New World, you received 50 more acres. So if you would sail back and forth between Europe like 3 more times, you would get 50 acres each time you sailed. So you get 50, 100, then 150 acres for those 3 trips. So every time you sailed back and forth between Europe and the New World, you would get 50 more acres of land that you owned if you bought your own ticket. So if you were rich and you were able to buy your own ticket to sail across back and forth between Europe and the new colonies, then you would get more and more land to control. And the more land you had, the more land you were able to grow crops. And you could sell those crops for money and you become more rich that way. So that's the headright system, is selling land, basically getting land, having enough money to get land. So that answers number 4. You have 50 acres. Then our next term is the plantation. So a plantation is kind of the field that they worked on. So these are huge, big, large, gigantic fields and areas of land, similar to a farm, but much bigger. And on the plantation, they almost always grew crops. So they didn't really grow or didn't really have any animals on the plantation. They mainly just grew crops. So there was no cows or pigs or horses or sheep. All the land on the plantation was grown to grow these 3 crops. So this is all the answer number 5. So you're going to type in these 3 crops right here. So they mainly grew tobacco, cotton, and indigo. Tobacco, cotton, and indigo were the 3 crops that were grown on a plantation. Tobacco, cotton, and indigo. So those 3 crops, those were the main crops that made a lot of money. So tobacco was grown here in the new colonies, and then it was shipped back across to Europe. And then basically everybody in Europe wanted tobacco, and they would use it for meals, for smoking. And that became a huge cash crop. So every time you grew tobacco, you'd make a lot of money. Then cotton was a crop that was used mainly for making different clothing and making different materials. And then we'll talk about indigo here in a second, because that's our another term here. And so there were lots of people that lived and worked on the plantation. So it first started off by indentured servants lived on the plantation and worked on the plantation. That was their main force of work, was working on the plantation and farming, picking crops, planting crops. And then over the years, the indentured servants started to transition into slavery. So this is kind of the beginning of slavery, the idea of slavery with these indentured servants. So it's first started off with indentured servants working on the plantation, and then it would eventually transition into the slaves working on the plantation. Alrighty, so that's plantations. These are huge, big, gigantic fields similar to farms, and they grew tobacco, cotton, and indigo. That helps you answer number 5, those 3 crops. So let's talk about what indigo is then. So indigo is our next term that we'll look at. So indigo, this was a plant used to make dye. So indigo was kind of used to dye different materials a different color. So they used indigo to dye a lot of materials purple and bluish. And so if you're looking at your show it, this will help you answer number 6. So indigo here.
Good morning, teachers and students. Sorry for the interruption. The IE list today, the academic focus list today has been sent to your email because we do not have a way to send it through the copier today. It's not cooperating. So could you please check that before the kids leave 3rd or 4th period, depending on your grade level, and it says where they are to report, and if by chance their grades have gone up and they can pull progress book up and show the IE teacher, we will send them back. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So indigo is a blue-purple color, so that'll help you answer number 6. So it's a blue-purple color, and you can see the indigo growing in the field in the 2 pictures on the bottom left and in the top right. And these crops were mainly grown in South Carolina. So South Carolina has some higher land to it and higher ground, and so the crops of indigo was mainly grown in South Carolina. And indigo came from the bean family. So it was a combination of beans put together as they were growing in a field. And then as that combination worked, they were able to grow this indigo crop. So indigo was used to dye different materials a different color. All righty, so that's indigo there. So that'll be answer number 6. And we got 2 more to look at real quickly. So our next term is a proprietor. So proprietor, this is a person, so this will be answer number 7. A proprietor is a person given control over a specific amount of land by the king. So a person given control over a specific amount of land by the king. So proprietor was basically given control over an area of land. So they helped enforce the king's rule over this area of land. And so the king would often hire proprietors to help make sure that the English rule was still happening in the colonies, because the king stayed in England and he never traveled into the 13 colonies who were still owned by England. So he hired these proprietors to help control some of the land and make sure that they were following the English rule. So the proprietary colonies were run by colonial charter agreements. And this agreement was between the British king and the colonists, allowing the colonists to govern and live on certain land in the New World. So the colonists could live in certain areas in the New World that was allowed by the king. So the proprietor, again, is a person given control over a specific amount of land by the king. So it's that first bullet point there. That'll help you answer number 7. A person given control over a specific amount of land by the king. All righty, and then our last question talks about the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. So this is also called the Act Concerning Religion. And this ensured freedom of religion for only the Christian faith. So that'll help you answer number 8. So basically ensured that the freedom of religion for only the Christian faith. So only Christians were able to practice their freedom of religion. And so if you were any other religion, then you were not allowed to have this religious freedom. So only Christian faith was able to practice their religion kind of however they wanted to. And it made it a crime to take away rights of Christians because of their religion. And hate speech was also no longer allowed. So the speech that was threatening or otherwise abusive speech toward a group of people based on their differences. So you couldn't post anything in the newspaper or say anything in the town square about a specific religion. And this kind of set the stage for the freedom of religion in the United States Constitution when we find our country about 100 years later in 1776. Okay? So the Maryland Toleration Act basically enforced or allowed the freedom of religion for only the Christian faith in the Southern colonies. All righty? So that'll help you answer all of our questions for today. So once you get that question answered in there, then you can go ahead and submit the